Good evening. I'm Duncan McRae. I'm an Associate Professor of Ancient Greek and Roman Studies and a faculty affiliate of the Berkeley Center for Jewish Studies. On behalf of the Center, I'm delighted to welcome you this evening to an event with Dr. Susan Kahn and Professor Tom Laqueur on the topic of Susan's fascinating new book on Rudolphina Menzel, Canine Pioneer, The Extraordinary Life of Rudolphina Menzel, which was published last year by Brandeis Press. Susan Kahn is the Associate Director of the Julis Rabinowitz Program on Jewish and Israeli Law at Harvard Law School. Educated first here at Berkeley and subsequently at Harvard, the two finest institutions in life. She is a social anthropologist and a scholar of Jewish studies. In her first book, Reproducing Jews, a cultural account of assisted conception in Israel, which was published in 2000 by Duke, she conducted an ethnographic investigation of contemporary Israeli investment in fertility treatments. She also has published on the interactions between genetic science and Jewish tradition and identity. Most recently, as you likely know, she has turned her attention to the fascinating kynologist, dog scientist and trainer Rudolphina Menzel, about whom we're going to hear much more very shortly. Tom Laqueur is the Helen Fawcett Professor of History Emeritus here at UC Berkeley. I think he's been here 50 years. He is a preeminent historian of the body, of sex, of gender, and it is fair to say that his work has changed the way that histories of all of these essential elements of human life are now told. He is the recipient of very many honors, prizes, and lectureships, too many to proverbially count. His most recent work has taken him beyond the human animal, or maybe not, to the dog. With Alexander Nehamas, he published an essay in Kipal quite recently titled, "Can the Dog Really Be Man's Best Friend? A Dialogue Between Humans." And his faculty lecture here at Berkeley a few years ago was on the topic of how dogs make us human. And a book on this subject is coming soon from Penguin. He's the perfect person, I think, to be in dialogue with Susan and Rudolphina. Just to introduce you to the event, we're going to have a dialogic form. So Dr. Kahn will first introduce her book for about 20 minutes. She will then be in conversation with Professor Laqueur before we open up the dialogue for the remainder of our time together. So thank you, Susan, and thank you, Tom.
Terrific. Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here. I want to thank John Efron for organizing this and Etta for all of her help pulling it together. It's very exciting to be back in Dwinell Hall, where I haven't been for over 40 years, but nothing has changed. Smells exactly the same. This is only the third time I've spoken about this book. It was ostensibly published in November 22, but it really only came out in the beginning of February. So I'm so pleased that you are all here. I'm really curious to hear what your responses are. And I'm very grateful to Professor Laqueur for agreeing to be the interlocutor. I agree, great bonus of being at Berkeley. So I'm going to attempt to do an entire life in 20 minutes. And this was a pretty full life, so I apologize in advance for going a little bit quickly. Trigger warning, I am going to be speaking about a Zionist. And, as a friend of mine said, please don't accuse me of dog washing. Okay? That's an inside Zionist joke. Okay. So these are the dates of Rudolphina Menzel, 1891 to 1973. She was born in Vienna, right down the street from Freud, part of that we're very familiar fin de siècle, cosmopolitan, bourgeois, assimilated elite of Vienna. She was a very unusual young woman. Here she is just as a young girl with her prosperous family. This is in the late 1890s. This is my favorite picture of her. You get a sense of the kind of character we're dealing with here. This is the teenage Rudolphina. This was about the time that she skipped school and lied to her parents in order to attend Theodor Herzl's funeral as it wound its way through the streets of Vienna. She had, of her own volition, she was the only person in her family to become a very committed Zionist and socialist from a very young age. And you also, I think in this picture, you see the intelligence and brilliance. I think you can see it in that determined, strident expression on her face. As a young girl, she went to a socialist progressive school and then enrolled at the University of Vienna, where in the same department actually as Freud. And she completed her PhD in chemistry at the University of Vienna in 1914. It was also at the University of Vienna that she joined the Theodor Herzl College Club. And she circled there, you may notice, she's the only woman in the Theodor Herzl College Club. She had to argue her way in. It was a single-sex institution, and there she is. This was significant on many levels for just her intellectual and political development, but it also was important on a personal realm because that's her future husband, Rudolf. And yes, his name is Rudolf, and her name is Rudolphina, and that was just one of the many elements of their very providential partnership. This is a very nice picture of them on the eve of World War I. Rudolf joined the army as a medic. He was a physician. And Rudolphina, with her PhD in chemistry, was put in charge of a large chemical laboratory outside of Vienna during World War I. Now, after the war, the young Menzel couple decided to settle in Linz, home of the Linzer Tort, where Hitler spent his youth. It was a provincial city at the time, in about 175 miles west of Vienna. It was a very big decision for the young couple because, of course, Rudolphina left all of her intellectual compatriots behind. And Rudolf had a job there as a doctor. He was working in the hospital. But Rudolphina, for the first time in her life, was at loose ends. She's in her early to mid-20s. And one of Rudolf's patients, in exchange for treating him, gave the Menzels their first dog. And here's a picture of Rudolphina with her first boxer. His name was Mowgli, after the Jungle Book character. And for those of you, I'm so grateful, we've got some real service dog experts here. This is a proto-boxer, so this is still a very mastiff-looking type dog. And in the next picture, you get a sense, this is a huge animal. This is quite a strong, rambunctious animal. It was her pet, but he was, you know, a very, he was really a piece of equipment. And that's how she came to see him. I go into in some length in the book, and I think it's actually quite fascinating, how she just became obsessed with this dog. And, you know, many of us here have a dog, we love our dog, we walk our dog, we may read a couple of books about dogs, but Rudolphina decided to completely reinvent herself I'm glad we have a Greek scholar here, as a kynologist. Kynology is the scientific study of the domestic dog. And in the interwar period, between World War I and World War II, amongst Central European people, kynology was a very popular subject. You had Konrad Lorenz was a very big, famous, obviously Nobel Prize-winning ethologist who was a kynologist at the time. It was a pastime of the petty bourgeois Austrian sort of rural bourgeoisie, of whom, needless to say, Rudolphina stuck out a little bit as a little tiny cosmopolitan Jewish woman. And I have a slide in a moment where I will show you her new friends, her new social circle. But this picture was taken in the early 1920s. Mowgli was the gateway to an entirely new scientific career, and I go into in some depth in the book the kind of flexibility of mind that you needed to have to reinvent yourself and master an entirely new set of scientific disciplines in order to become a kynologist, which she did with great alacrity. And she convinced her husband to build a number of kennels, get people in the neighborhood of there. They moved right outside of Linz to a little village called Klein-München, Little Munich. And she started a kennel. She started a breeding kennel and a training kennel. She started breeding Mowgli with other boxers. And just in the interest of time, I will just tell you that between 1922 and 1938, she bred over 1,000 boxers, which she weighed, measured, and observed every single day of their lives. So she started this extremely ambitious longitudinal research study on canine behavior and development. She was very interested in canine psychology, and as a dog breeder, of course, she was a eugenicist. All pedigree dog breeders practice eugenics, where they're, engineering reproductive pairings in order to produce ideal outcomes. And she became a master dog breeder. And she developed this longitudinal research study that over the course of the next 16 years generated an incredible amount of data, and I'll mention that more in a moment. It was a landmark study that until today, in the German language dog training literature, there are citations to a number of her discoveries and interventions. At the same time, throughout the 1920s, as she's building her kennel, this is a nice picture of Rudolphina and Rudolph, with Rudolph's parents in the middle. You get a nice sense of the expression on Rudolph's parents' faces, like, what the hell did our son get himself into here? Looking very dubious. But here they are at home in Kleinmünchen, and I like this picture, one, because you see, again, Rudolphina's determined expression, and two of their house boxers. But this home became a meeting place for the international kynological community. And people made pilgrimages from all over Europe and even as far away as Hawaii and Cairo and all over the place to come and meet Rudolphina and learn about her methods, her techniques, and her thinking on canine cognition, dog breeding, and dog behavior. Here's another picture of the Menzels outside. Here are three of their very ferocious-looking dogs outside of their kennel in their yard in Kleinmünchen. This is the picture I was referring to earlier. Here's a picture of Rudolphina with her new friends, her Austrian petty bourgeois landed gentry dog breeding friends. And you can see that this is actually a picture of the Austrian Sinological Association at a landmark conference that she organized in 1930. And you can see they're all boxer lovers. They all are with their boxers. I just wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of the kind of scientific literature that she generated. These are two slides. She always published with her husband. These are all R&R Menzel, Rudolf and Rudolphina Menzel. She generated all of the data, had all the theories, made all the conjectures, but being, here at Berkeley, you're very familiar with crazy creative people. She had a little bit of trouble imposing order on her results, and that's where Rudolf was just the ideal partner for her, because he was a very clear thinker and managed to rationalize her data. And there were dozens of these studies that emerged. There's Hebrew. Well, I took this actually out of this was from a memorial magazine that was published at her death in 1973. Someone in Haifa had gathered all of her publications together. So throughout the late 1920s and 1930s, Rudolphina is doing her research and becoming very popular and sought after as a consultant, not only by kynological scientific researchers, but by officers in the Austrian and German police and military. And she starts traveling. She starts traveling all over Central Europe, and in fact, in Berlin, in a place called Kummersdorf, which was outside of Berlin. It was the Weimar Republic's military training facility. They built a special pavilion for Rudolphina because she was such a frequent visitor, and they wanted her to be as comfortable as possible. And Rudolphina says in her book that, in her memoir on which this is based, very happy to talk about. I didn't invent this. This is actually based on a lot of archival research. Very happy to tell you where I got a lot of this information. But Rudolphina says that when she took the train to Berlin, she was treated like Marie Curie. They picked her up in a sleek Mercedes-Benz and they drove her to Kummersdorf, and she was a consultant. And she had a great sense of humor, Rudolphina, and she said, of course I was treated like Marie Curie. I mean, why wouldn't I be? So she was barely 5 feet tall, but very bold and extremely confident. So she is consulting with the German and Austrian police. She's publishing all of these articles, and she's also running a kennel. And the kennel is named, excuse me, the kennel is named B'nai Satan, which for those of you who speak Hebrew means children of the devil. And she was a very, very devoted to try and realize not only her scientific commitments, but her Zionist commitments simultaneously. So as she's writing all these articles in German and breeding all of these dogs, she simultaneously is trying to convince the leaders of the Yishuv to start training dogs to guard Jewish settlements, Jewish orchards, forests, etc., in the land of Palestine. So she's saying that dogs could be of integral help to the Zionist project. And it wasn't actually until 1938 that until 1934, I'm sorry, that she finally went to Palestine for the first time and ran her first training course for dog trainers. I'll get to that more in a moment. Before I move off the scientific slide, I just wanted, for the dog experts here, I just wanted to mention two discoveries that she made, which I think you'll find interesting. So Rudolphina had a PhD in chemistry, so she was the first person to assert and to prove that each individual has their own individual scent. And that's a very important discovery if you're using dogs to track people, to find people, whether it's for police work, whether they're criminals, or whether they're lost or hidden, or somehow they need to be tracked and found. So it was in 1930 she published her landmark study on the fact that based on her understanding of subcutaneous secretions, that each individual has their own scent. So that was one of her big innovations. And the other thing that she did, which of course I'm sure those of you who are dog people will be familiar with, is that she invented the canine temperament test. And this is now a completely ubiquitous test for both for dog breeders and in rescue shelters. And I reprint two of them in the book. It's a series, it's a sort of a battery of tests to determine what personality an individual dog has. What she did was transpose human psychological testing onto dogs. And this was a great innovation. And it sort of was along the same principle, right? That the right dog has to be matched to the right job. And in order to do so, you have to understand the psychology of each individual dog. Are they skittish? Are they forgiving? Are they sociable? Are they resource guarding? All of the basic different aspects that make up a particular canine personality. She invented this test, and it wasn't just her tests and her breeding and her incredible innovations in this area. It was her ability to communicate this to these audiences that was in enormous demand. Here's this was an insert in the Linz Daily Post in 1933. It's a picture of one of her dogs, Uther Ben Satan, and I put this here just to give you a sense. As I mentioned with Mowgli, these are not furry little creatures, right? Friendly, furry little lapdogs. These are really forms of military technology. That's the way she understood a dog, as something that could assist human beings in modern technological societies to perform various tasks, and often various nefarious tasks. I will preempt the obvious question, happy to go into this in greater depth. It was her methods and techniques for dog breeding and her understanding of canine psychology that were absolutely absorbed into the Third Reich. And she trained all of her dogs, I should say, all the dogs that she sold to the German, Austrian military and police, only to respond to commands in Hebrew. That was another little zets of her Hebrew, of her Zionist, a little way that she expressed her Zionism. And I did find, and I can't say that this is definitive because I haven't seen the source myself, but somebody just recently told me they had seen a German newspaper from the mid-1930s that said that the German police were complaining. So this is after the Third Reich has emerged, and the German police are complaining that they have to retrain the dogs to stop responding to Hebrew commands. So they have to teach them to respond to commands in Hebrew. So otherwise, they were only responding to Shev, Arza, Bo, etc. So this was, and this, just if you need a reminder, this is a picture of a German military police dog in, I believe that's in 1934. So the 1930s were an extremely interesting and busy time, obviously in the world, but certainly for Rudolphina. She, as I mentioned, had traveled to Palestine for the first time in 1934 to run her first dog handling training course in Palestine. She came back to Austria in 1935 in order to lead the Austrian delegation to the Third International World Canine Congress, which was held like the Nazi Olympics a year later in 1936, was held, this is a picture of the Canine Congress, was held to sort of showcase German greatness on an international stage. There were over 3,300 dogs that were exhibited at this Congress. Unsurprisingly, Hitler's dog won first place. But this was also a scientific Congress that brought together researchers from all over Europe, from England, from France, from Austria, et cetera. And I go into the book in some, because Rudolphina described this scene quite vividly in her memoir of the various attitudes of the different delegations to this event. I will say that Rudolph delivered a paper based on Rudolphina's research at this event, in which they very brazenly declared in front of this room full of Nazis that there's no such thing as race, that each individual is the product of, has their own unique personality, their own unique mosaic of personality traits, and that there's no such thing as race. And that's interesting in a German context, because the word for Rasse and the word for race and breed are the same. They're Rasse. Needless to say, that was the end of her career in Germany. Not that she was eager to continue to publish her work in Germany after the rise of the Reich, but this is the slide this was the table that she presented at the that Rudolph actually spoke about at the Third International Congress. I have looked through the program of the Third International Kynological Congress, and believe me, this is by far the most elaborate research that was presented there. This particular research was on the heritability of the eagerness to track. And this obviously was based on her extraordinarily in-depth research that she was doing in her kennel lab. It was both a kennel and a laboratory where she was breeding these thousands of boxers, ultimately 1,000 boxers. And as I mentioned, she was, a practicing eugenicist. And that is a whole other set of really interesting questions, I think, about how lay dog breeders in Nazi Germany and their understanding of eugenics was sought after information by the Nazis for their own desires to try and understand how to breed humans. I don't think I have that much more time, do I? Let me go quickly to Palestine. So 1938, they get their order. The municipality outside of Linz says the Jewish kennel must be shut. The Menzels rushed to pack up. I should have mentioned they never had children. I don't know if they didn't have children by design or by fate. They did have 1,000 boxers, however. And they rushed to pack up their life work. And on illegal papers, they managed to escape from Nazi-occupied Austria in August. I think the Anschluss was in March, and they managed to get out in August. And they go to Palestine, and here's Rudolphina at the house, at her house in Kiryat Motzkin, right north of Haifa. The Jewish agency gave her a house, and she immediately put up a sign that said, the Palestine Research Institute for Canine Psychology and Training. And it was from that hub that she spent the next 10 years inventing the entire canine infrastructure in Palestine. And I want to just go over that super quickly because the pictures are so good. I could go on at length. For the dog people, I think this was interesting, might be interesting for you. It's one of her pedigree boxers that she brought with her from Europe. This is a Saluki bred by the Bedouin as hunting dogs. And this is, anybody who's been to Palestine and Israel-Palestine knows this as a Canaan dog, or one of the many feral dogs that just run around. And these are a kind of dog that are prevalent all over the developing world. They're just like a feral, they're in the kynological literature, they're known as village dogs or pariah dogs. They used to be known as pariah dogs, but they're just like semi-feral hounds. She started conducting temperament tests on any dog she could get her hands on to determine what kind of job they could do. Could they guard kibbutzim, moshavim, orchards, forests, fields, etc. And she started running her dog training courses. Here's a bunch of young Palestinian Jewish dog trainers in the late 1930s. She founded the Palestine Kennel Club in 1937, and of course this was a way of ingratiating herself with the wives of the British Mandate police officers, because of course they were all English ladies, they had nothing to do, so they would serve as the judges for her Palestine Kennel Club dog shows. I don't think I have time, sadly, to show, this is a very funny clip from a dog show in Haifa in 1938. Oh, you want to see it? I pirated this from the Israel Film Archive. But you also get, this is 1938, so this is not long after she got there. And this is on Mount Carmel. These are, there's sort of an odd assortment of dogs. You also get to see a couple of pet dogs. And, here's a couple of pet dogs. Now, this whole culture clash between these German-speaking Jews who immigrated to Palestine in the 1930s as part of the Fifth Aliyah with their dog-loving ways, they were not, the Jews of the Yishuv, most of whom came from Eastern European shtetls, were not big dog lovers. So it was another wrinkle to this kind of well-known cultural divide. Then the Yishuv Jews thought that these German-speaking Jews were just nuts with their Cocker Spaniels and their little pet lap dogs. And there's some I found some, one of the things Rudolphina did is she published this newsletter called Hakalban, the dog keeper, for about 5 years in the early 1940s. And a lot of the articles are about how to, how to convince the Jews of the Yishuv to start liking dogs. And one of the purposes of the dog shows, in fact, was to familiarize Jews who were, descendants of Eastern European Jews, not to be afraid of dogs. That dogs can do things, that they can climb walls, that they can participate in building the Zionist, project, the Zionist land, etc. She also, this is Rudolphina participating with members of the Palestine Police in search operations. So Rudolphina trained, was a very sought-after consultant by the British Mandate Palestine Police at the time. She trained dogs for the Haganah. Here's this is actually 1946, there's a proto dog unit in the Haganah. And then in the 1948 war, a number of her dogs, these are all pictures from the 1948 war that come from the Haganah archives. Dogs were trained to carry messages, to carry ammunition, to carry supplies, to track, to detect mines, to guard prisoners, and do all kinds of other things. This is, I just want to show you this one clip quickly. This is of the Victory Day Parade in Tel Aviv in 1939. This is through the streets of Tel Aviv. This is the dog unit that participated in the war. And the reason that I love this particular clip, it's a very short one, is because I've circled here, that woman I've circled is Esther Cohn. She's in her 90s and she lives in a retirement community in Haifa. And she was one of my prime informants for this study. She was Rudolphina Menzel's principal acolyte. And as a young girl, she worked in her kennels in the house in Haifa and knew both of the Menzels very well. Okay, I really don't have time. I'm going to say two more things. So the war ends. It's 1949. Rudolphina's 58 years old, 59 years old. Could have been the end of her career, could have been exhausted, could have said, I've had it, that's it, I'm retiring. But oh no, she decides to completely reinvent herself, founds the first guide dog training school in the Middle East, convinces Helen Keller to come and give the opening remarks at her Seeing Eye Dog Institute. That's in 1952. She also takes those feral dogs, those village dogs of Palestine, and she writes a breed standard for them, and she invents a new breed, the Israel Canaan Dog, which you can see participating in Crufts and Westminster and everything else. Never wins, very unlikely to win. This is, she writes, for those of you who know about dogs, right? It's a very skittish, untrainable dog, but it does have a breed standard, and some of them can be quite good house pets. Israel Today, very active in the service dog training world, and that's Rudolphina. Thank you.
Well, it's Thank you. The book is, and the the book and the other essays in it are even richer than you suggest. I just two small points. She also helped translate with a Hebrew scholar the first, as you point out, the first manual for dog training.
That's right.
In Hebrew. There weren't a lot of words in biblical Hebrew for various features of dog training. And
she worked with a German philologist to translate. She wrote a 200-page long Hebrew dog training manual in the late 1930s and had to find words for muzzle and,
Right, so there they are, the newly founded Hebrew University trying to figure out German dog terms.
Right.
Which, other thing, while on Hebrew, as you point out, it's true that the dogs were learning commands in Hebrew, but as you say, police dogs have to be trained in some foreign language. So
right.
it was ironic she had the German police dog trained in Hebrew rather than French.
That's right.
Which was presumably a probably less known language. So footnotes. But so there are two ways we could go in this conversation, and it's sort of the Jewish studies part of this crowd and the dog training part of this crowd, and how they come together.
Right.
So one of the
for the first time.
Maybe for the first time. So there's this great line of the Yiddish saying that if you see a Jew with a dog, it's either not a Jew or not a dog.
Right.
And Rudolphina was very keen, and it's quoted in here, I think, quote, of saying, if we're going to have a new people in Israel, a new sort of Jew, we have to have a Jew that can relate to the dog. So part of the Canaan project is to sort of revive a dog that from the Bedouins, which may have been the dog that the Jews left behind when they went to Babylon, and so there's a whole nationalist version of that story. So there's a Zionist part of her and the dog, which I want you to comment on. And then there's a second part for the dog training part is that she invented just lots of dog training techniques. So I thought one of the interesting things that you talk about here is learning to discover minds without blowing yourself up.
Right.
I mean, these are valuable dogs. Get it, they can step on a mine, that would do it. But that was not the point. And likewise with tracking, yes, they could track these, send messages, but she figured out techniques for teaching them. So I guess I'd start by maybe talking about her Zionism and dogs on the one hand, her dog training techniques on the other, and then maybe doing a little more bringing those two strands together? Is that?
I mean, there's so much to say about how that was her goal. I mean, I think on the blurb of the back of the book is teaching Jews to like dogs and training dogs to serve Jews became Menzel's unique kind of Zionist mission. So this was, in addition to her entire scientific agenda and her very serious scientific career, she had this thing. She would bring busloads of children once she moved to Haifa. She'd bring busloads of children to learn how to play with puppies and get over their fear of dogs. She traveled all over Palestine to different settlements to try and get Jews to overcome their fear of dogs. And she writes very convincingly. She wrote articles in newspapers throughout the 1930s and 40s. She did speak Hebrew with a very heavy German accent, and she did manage to write Hebrew too. But she was on it was a PR campaign, really, of trying to convince Jews of the ways that dogs could help them and not to be afraid of them. And so that really was part of her, it was a campaign. It was a campaign she started in the 20s and really pursued for her whole life. I should mention, they were real, and this might be of interest to you, Tom. I mean, in the book I mentioned that they wrote two children's books, the Menzel couple. They wrote a German children's book in 1930 called Schwalbensummer, and they wrote a Hebrew language children's book in 1968 called, He, She, and My Dog, something like that. And in both books, their real goal was to try and get children to understand that animals have human-like emotions, and part of being a human is understanding the animal world. So in terms of her, that was what she wanted, that was part of her Zionism, was to try and, she understood that as part of bringing Jews back to the land.
Can I just footnote that, because I want you to talk about the training part too, but she had this flirtation with Boomer for a while.
She did, yes.
And that's the sort of, the Jew is, it's just a certain kind of human, and this version there is to have a Jew be a certain kind of human who also likes dogs.
That's right.
It's sort of Boomer meets the...
It's a very Berkeley, it's a very Berkeley kind of Jewish person that she had in mind. A Buber-loving, dog-loving, sort of Zionist person.
So they would say, so that's the Zionist trajectory. Do you talk a little bit about the actual technical training parts for the defense establishment? Because I thought what you said about how you train dogs to sniff mines was kind of great.
So this is an area in the book where I was reading a lot of secondary literature on this, on how to train, on the history of dog training, and particularly in the interwar period. And there was a lot going on in Switzerland, in Austria, and Germany at the time. It's actually, as I mentioned, they were trying to understand how to use dogs to be part of the modernization project. So, dogs have always lived in companionship with humans, as shepherds, as as herders, as leading dog sleds, etc. But this whole was really in World War I that armies started to use dogs to perform these various tasks. And I think that, she was in contact with Pavlov. There was a lot of communication. Her little house in Kleinmünchen, as I mentioned, attracted all of these scientific experts to try and figure out, how does a dog think, and how can we better understand how a dog thinks in order to train them to conduct various tasks.
Right,
I didn't really answer your question.
No, well, I thought what you said about the mind is sort of fascinating. I mean, that you could say, well, okay, teach him to smell a mine. That's not what she did.
Right. She was.
Teach him to metal, for example. She
Right.
didn't teach him to smell metal. She said that was dumb.
She taught them how to smell disturbances in the earth. Right. It wasn't the metal that they were after, because if they smelt the metal, then they would explode.
Right.
Right. So she taught, and it was actually her expertise in canine olfaction and the canine sense of smell that was most useful to the Jews in the Yishuv during the 48 war, because she trained the people who were hiding the Jewish stores of ammunition, how to hide those ammunition stores from the British patrol dogs. Right. So she had to understand, what does a dog respond to, and is that sort of
well, yeah, but she could have thought they respond to metal. The dog can smell metal. But she decided that's not so smart.
Right.
So she taught them these experiments, how to teach a dog to respond to disturbed dirt.
Right.
And she felt that if she worked on this enough, she could have dirt that was disturbed up to a week or so later,
That's
which was
right.
very clever. She'd bury a box with some food in it, and the dog would smell it, and she'd get a reward, and she'd keep doing like this till the dog figured out disturbed dirt is a good thing to pay attention to, but don't dig it till the guy tells you to. Right?
Exactly.
And the same thing is true, I think, with the messaging. This was before cell phones, right? And even walkie-talkies, they had relatively little technology.
That's right.
So she figured out how to.
That whole, particularly in the 48 war, which was kind of a small-scale guerrilla war type situation, to have a message dog. Obviously, dogs were not fighting on the Arab side. Dogs were only fighting it was only Jews who were using dogs in that war. And no historians of the 48 war have looked at the benefits that, not only psychological benefits, but the actual military benefits of having dogs that were carrying ammunition, supplies, messages, etc., in that kind of terrain, over, when the combat is fought at a very close range, and you need to be able to communicate with people. In a very tense, small-scale situation, dogs were super helpful.
Right. I mean, the thing is, I thought, so there's a lot more to be said about just the training thing. You want to say that studying dog cognition was maybe next to chimps, the biggest part of animal psychology. And after the war, even exceeded it. I mean, dogs were the primary animal. You figure Darwin was very interested. If you could figure out how dogs think, you could figure out how people thought.
Right.
So that's a kind of a background to you. But the other thing that was interesting, I thought the last chapter in the book was about how she's almost forgotten it in Palestine and Israel.
Right.
Part of it is there was this scandal when people attacked her for being too prone to boxers.
Yeah, she was definitely
and she defended herself against this, but there was a local brouhaha about boxers, but seemed to go downhill from then. And then now she's not remembered. So you could talk a little. And people want to ask later, but there's an interesting ethical set of issues here, what you want to have dogs do. In other words, having just read about dogs in tracking slaves, the fact that she's training dogs to track Arabs is not, as you say, trigger warning.
Right.
So maybe both questions. One, if you want to comment on the ethical, how you now think of how you teach this, the ethical part of it.
Right.
And secondly, why she's sort of forgotten given her manifest importance in the history of Zionism and of the creation of.
Right.
Well,
I mean,
and then I think we can open it up for other questions. I think.
So I'll start with the first question. You know, why is she forgotten in Israel? And this is a compilation. So the first half of the book is my biography of her, and then I asked 6 different dog experts to write short little, like 5 to 6 page chapters on specific instances of her life that were interesting. And the last chapter is why is there no Rudolphina Menzel in Israel? Why does nobody know about Rudolphina Menzel in Israel? Very, very few people know about her. Even though she really was the Henrietta Zold, Chaim Weitzman, and Sigmund Freud of dogs all rolled into one. And I think part of the argument that Tammy Bar Yosef makes in the book is that, you know, it's because she was a woman, it's because she wasn't a mother, it's because she, you know, she didn't get killed like Hannah Senesh did as a great, you know, she wasn't a martyr. But I think there's another, you sort of hinted at it. I think she was a very difficult woman. Yep. Right? I mean, and I think that even in speaking to Esther Cohn, who was my informant, Esther Cohn was really very fond of Rudolph. But Rudolphina was obviously very difficult.
Piece of work, right?
Yeah, she was a piece of work. And so I think any of her, you know, of her acolytes or her, you know, her mentees, I don't think were that eager to memorialize her, which I think is sad. Yep. Because you know, I foreground her relationship with her husband because a woman like that, a woman like that had to have a husband like that in order to be who she was. It had to have the financial support, the intellectual support, the emotional and psychological support. So, you know, that to be the person that she was, of course she was a difficult woman. Yep. Right? She couldn't have not been. So I just wonder to what extent that played into it. I'll answer the ethical question.
Also, she worked for the British during the British Mandate, which has people have different views on this in the Zionist movement.
Absolutely.
She was not politically sound in many ways, or not by their standard back then, helping the British, and not by our standards.
Well, the dogs blur the boundaries. The dogs blur the boundaries. And it's certainly, you know, she herself, I'll answer the ethical question the way she herself answered it. Right. Because in the early 1960s, I found she gave an interview with an Israeli journalist and wrote that, and they asked her, have you ever thought about what happened, you know, to the dogs you trained and how they got incorporated into the Third Reich? And she said, I've thought a lot about it, and it's caused me an enormous amount of pain and sadness. So she was certainly aware of the fact that her dogs were weapons and they were used as weapons. And you know, service dog training is about breeding a form of technology, and she was a real expert at it. Right. That said, I think it's interesting to note that, you know, she spent all of her years up until the entire first 20 years of her career training, you know, attack dogs, police dogs, patrol dogs, and she spent the rest of her career training service dogs that helped people. Right. And she was very adamant when she founded her guide, you know, and the whole guide dog school raises all kinds of other really interesting questions, because you have to convince people, Jews, how to live, not just how to work with a dog, but how to live with a dog if it's your guide dog. You have to learn how to live with a dog. And many of the blind people in Israel in the 1950s were Jews, recent immigrants from North African and Middle Eastern countries, also not dog lovers, and also not, you know, not highly educated, et cetera. And so she was adamant in her, she pioneered, it actually became an international standard for mobility readiness, a test to determine who's going to work effectively with what sort of blind person will work most effectively with a dog. And she was adamant that IQ shouldn't be a prerequisite, that background shouldn't be a prerequisite. Right. She had Arabs and Jews, both blind Arabs and Jews that she was training, giving dogs to, and training to how to increase their mobility. And I should just add, you know, the mobility readiness and the guide dog training really mobilized her deep socialist sympathies as well, because she wanted blind people to be able to participate economically in society on an equal basis with sighted people. And she writes about that very movingly, and, you know, was really ahead of her time, I think, in that regard.
In one way, just point out that from the dog perspective, she was also, I don't know if you put it behind her time, but historically informed. That is to say, she developed these tests, for example, for a dog to understand how high a barrier was to determine whether the person could go through it.
That's right.
I don't know about the height, but with the dogs have been leading the blind since forever. And Montaigne, and he cites the Stoics, goes on about the fact that dogs have this ability to do it.
Right.
So she translated a very old classical idea of dog intelligence into an actual test for training a dog. So she was very clever in translating folk, but she was obviously learned in this kind of stuff as an educated person, and translating that to blind training dogs for the blind.
I think she had an omnivorous, totally omnivorous intelligence. And I think that she, you know, and many of the people of her background in class were like that, right? They had an extraordinary literary backgrounds. They had extraordinary, you know, they were insatiable in their desire. She certainly was insatiable in her desire for knowledge throughout her entire life. She ended her career as a professor of animal psychology at Tel Aviv University. And, you know, just until the day she died, she was active, charismatic, always on, always going. Just an indefatigable character.
Duncan's going to take, I mean, we could talk forever, but Duncan,
right? The dialogue is already so lively, but it can only be more lively with more voices. Thank you, Susan. I think you've earned the title of your book. It really is an extraordinary life. So we have about, I think, 15 minutes or 20 minutes for some questions. So please, yes.
I'm just struck by, you actually think of Europe and dogs and hunting. And she was in a more like a subset?
That's right. I mean, a lot of those Austrian dog lovers, they use dogs for hunting, absolutely. And that's what made it so not Jewish, right? And that's where she really stood out. I mean, as I said, she named her kennel B'nai Satan. She gave all of her dogs Hebrew names. They only responded to Hebrew commands. She was very out, you know, as a Jew in that world. She picked it, well, she was doing police dog training, primarily police and military dog training, but she knew, you know, people who were doing, was very good friends with the Hungarian sheep dog trainings, apparently were the best in the world, and she was very close to them, close to people who were doing guide dog training in Switzerland. They all seemed to know each other, and they were exchanging information, and it was a real intellectual, you know, community.
And the techniques, I think, for hunting were the same as the techniques for tracking.
Yeah.
I mean, she knew all this stuff. I mean,
yes.
Yeah, I'm just so fascinated by the idea of dogs as a technology in state making. And so I'm wondering if after the end of the big empires at the end of the First World War, can you find other examples of like the example of Israel, where people are trying to get the dog technology into the nation?
So that's a super interesting question, and yeah, this kind of integrating. In fact, dogs were first trained as police assistants in 1896 in Austria, not far from Linz, where she was living at the time, you know, later. But that whole idea of how to integrate dogs into modern industrial societies as assistants and workers and, you know, as service companions was just, after World War I, was just exploding. I mean, because people saw the utility of dogs in World War I. So then they started thinking, what are all the different ways that we can, you know, that we can train dogs to serve human beings in these different contexts. And so it's quite different, although there's a lot of overlap with the dog fancy, right, of pet dogs and pedigree dog breeding, just, you know, for, you know, breeding for phenotypic types that look a certain way just in order to enjoy them, and the plasticity of the canine genome was something that was very interesting to people also. But this whole question of breeding dogs for utility, understanding canine psychology, transposing what was really burgeoning in the world of human psychology onto dogs was active all over Europe, a little bit less before World War II in America, but certainly after, throughout the 1950s and 60s, it became very popular in America too.
Well, can I just say, the unpleasant part of this is that the Southern training of dogs as mod slaves was immediately transferred to running Southern prisons. So,
that's interesting.
you know, so
Yeah.
they became prison guards in it's Alabama plantation,
Right.
and I mean, I still saw guards guarding chain gangs when I was a kid.
Wow.
There's an unpleasant side to this technology.
There's no question. I mean, they are weapons.
And in the South, it has a manifest racist.
I think there was a
Unpleasant.
lot of communication, in fact, between the American South and the Nazis about
Oh, absolutely.
about dog training in particular, like how to, you know, what are the best
Rudolph,
techniques. Right.
Yes.
I'll reveal my prejudice for herding dogs here, but did she ever sort of expand what she was doing regarding the different types of dogs and what their instincts were like, and how to see their instincts and how to work with them with different kinds of dogs?
Well, so that raises a really interesting question. Right. She had to, because she got to Palestine in 1938. She's been breeding boxers, which are a very, you know, pedigree German European dog that did not function well in the Middle Eastern climate, right? So one of the reasons she became so interested in the Canaan dog, in the local breed of climatically adapted dog, which in Palestine at the time were only being used by the Bedouin as canine alarm systems. They would catch them, they'd tie a rope around their neck, they'd put them on a stake outside a goat enclosure, and they would just make sure they would, you know, start barking if jackals came to attack the goat herd in the middle of the night, the goats in the middle of the night. So she, I just completely lost my train of thought. I got lost with the Bedouin. Oh, so she then, she had to figure out, she traveled all over Palestine doing her temperament tests on these wild feral dogs who are often rabid, tick-infested, full of diseases, parasites, all kinds of things. And she was trying to cull them, you know, not cull them to kill them, but to select those that showed any kind of potentially productive temperament. And she boasts about, you know, she had this Canaan dog named Hagar. She named it Hagar, and who became a very effective mine detecting dog. She had another, one of her favorite, in establishing her Canaan dog breeding program, one of her favorite Canaan dogs that she found running around outside the outskirts of Kiryat Motzkin was named Dugma. She named him Dugma, for example. And she trained him. He had an outstanding temperament. And he became her pet and would accompany her on her bus trips to Haifa, and et cetera. So that took an extraordinary intelligence and stick-to-itiveness in order to take anybody who's ever been to Israel, Palestine has seen those dogs. If you've ever seen, or anywhere you've been where you see wild dogs, she was the first person ever to start a formal breeding program. She wrote a book about it in 1960 called Pariahhund in German, and actually had published an article about Pariahhunds in the kynological literature of 1948. She was the first person to publish a scientific study of those dogs, and she was very interested in them, not just because she needed service dogs who were climatically adapted to the Palestinian climate. She also the theory amongst her Austrian colleagues was that these dogs were the missing link between wolves and domestic dogs. And if she had this whole plan to study them and observe the processes of domestication in action, because those kynologists were asking the same kind of questions that ethologists and other kind of animal behavior people were interested in. What is the difference between tame and wild? How do we know when something gets domesticated? What is that process? So that was part of her scientific interest, was to try and use these dogs to conduct that scientific
Right, but
research.
you also point out, just specifically, you point out in the book that she worked at herding. I mean, she took different dogs and actually trained them to do post-war things.
That's right. In fact, when she was fleeing Nazi-occupied Austria on a train, on illegal papers, she and Rudolph with 2 of their boxers, and running for their lives. Right, they could have been stopped by the Gestapo at any minute, and Rudolphina wanted to stop outside of Budapest so badly and watch Hungarian herding dogs in action that she risked their lives in order to take a couple of days and go visit her Hungarian herding dog friends, because she wanted to bring that knowledge to Palestine because she knew it would be useful to the people in the Yishuv.
Just want to give a chance to the person at the back.
Yes.
So I'm curious about her dedication to the boxer breed.
Right.
In part because it seems quite like how you described her.
Yeah, pugnacious. Pugnacious.
Self-possessed, loyal to one.
Right.
But, so there were a plethora of German breeds
Right.
to choose from. Does she write at all about
Why the boxer?
Why the boxer?
So, in fact, she was given that patient of Rudolph's who gave them a dog, in fact, gave them a Doberman Pinscher first. And the Doberman Pinscher, she loved the Doberman Pinscher, but he died of distemper after only a couple of days. And she really wanted another dog, and the only puppies that were available in Linz at the time were boxers. And it was completely by chance. Right. So then she got a boxer, and then she just fell in love with boxers and had them.
But you point out that she also wanted, for some of these tasks, a dog that wasn't interested in hunting, and didn't have the neurotic tendencies that boxers, will stay at home, do what they're supposed to be doing. And I think you say this in your section. That it turned out she was lucky. I mean, they got a breed that would kind of do what.
Exactly. I mean, I think it did match her personality, and it was a dog that had served was of enormous utility at the time, but it was completely an accident.
I was fascinated by the episode that you recounted of her saying there were no human races, just individuals.
Yeah.
Right.
Because it seems so much in tension with the logic of the work with animals. In other words, with animals, it's eugenics, it's breeding, it's improvement, it's clearly a kind of program that is very easily translatable into the same thing in humans.
Exactly.
So the real question is it simply contingent that she decides there are no human races, or does she really have a serious discussion of the, let's say, cultural construction of race for humans, whereas for animals it's natural?
I think that's such a good question. I mean, it was clear that partly she was making a point, right? Partly she wanted, and she had the data in order to make that point. And she was making a point about temperament, really, right? About that personality traits, that there are different traits that clearly are passed on, right? And different aptitudes are clearly passed on. But that different individuals manifest those aptitudes in very different ways. And because they manifest them in different ways, you really, there's not replication, that reproduction there's always some degree of accident and change and difference. And she was clearly using the platform of the Third Sinological Congress to make a political point. But at the same time, she does say that she quotes this Nazi scientist, Franz Alverdes, I believe his name was, who, had a specific kind of scientific formula that I think she believed correctly predicted that there were things that you could assume would be reproduced on a group level. But she I think, carefully made that political point about individual people, right? That these are not, that an individual is a combined mosaic of all kinds of different things, because she wanted to challenge their racist
But as
dogma.
you point out, people are often saying that the rise of dog breeds and the rise of racism go together.
Exactly.
And you have this nice thing that these Canaan dogs, who 3 generations ago were messing around the Bedouin camp. Next thing you know, she's writing the Westminster Kennel Club about how if we could have a purebred Canaan dog, but the mother is someone else, as long as she tells her the mother is. I mean, you had a nice section where you point out the kind of tension in that.
Right, and it's a really interesting tension, right? And people who breed dogs today, I think, are very interested in those kinds of questions.
Can I ask a follow-up? You've written before also on Jewish genes and investment in genetics, about partly it's a curiosity about how you came to this, and how that lines up with your own work. But also, yes, to some extent, how the sort of genetic story fit with her, with what she was?
So I went from human reproduction to canine reproduction. That's the, I don't know what's next, feline reproduction, I guess, is next. The whole, this book, I hope, because there's so much material, I was using her 265-page German language memoir. I was using a bunch of her materials that are in the Central Zionist Archives and the Haganah Archives in Israel. There's a whole story to be told that I don't know if I'm the person who's going to tell it, but that is exactly getting at these kinds of questions about it's a history of science question, right? About how has the study of human and canine genetics evolved, and it's still evolving. I mean, I was reading a lot of secondary literature. It's not my field, but I was reading a lot of secondary literature that is being written today about contemporary understandings of the reproduction of canine character traits. And I think you see different forms of scientific discourse, or different beliefs in the what's the word, the sort of reliability of genes to convey certain kinds of information. You see that that there's still an enormous amount of debate about that, I should say. I know I'm not really answering your question terribly effectively, but I guess that's because I think that it's a great question that really deserves a whole separate study.
And to Vito, yes, please.
Did she do any research on dog intelligence?
It's interesting. She did a lot of. She didn't think there was any such thing as canine IQ. She thought that there was aptitudes, that dogs express different aptitudes, but she didn't develop an IQ test for dogs. And again, that's another thing. From what I understand amongst people who breed dogs today, that is a very popular understanding of that there is no such thing as canine intelligence. There's the ability of the motivation of a dog to express certain aptitudes in relationship with their handler, right? So it's not something that just, you have abilities in a dog, you have tendencies in a dog, but the intelligence of a dog is not something that you can measure and quantify.
Just on the gene point, Berkeley was the Center for the Dog Genome Project.
I know.
And it was a failure in the sense that you just could not connect phenotype and genotype.
Right.
And I worked a little bit interested in this, and I just talked to Jasper Ryan, who ran this, could you, given all this genetic history and what we know about wolves and so forth, could you tell me, so when did the dog originate? I'm always asked this question, and you tell me all these problems. I need to answer it. Can you give me what I tell him? He said, "Oh, that's easy. At a time long ago in a land far away."
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, in short, we know next to Zippo about phenotype, genotype.
That's right.
Stuff.
Despite what canine DNA companies are telling you.
Well, and what all these guys are telling us, same with humans. I mean, they just.
That's right.
I mean,
the tools are not.
You talk to the geneticists, they tell you just. I've talked to a bunch of them here. They just don't go there.
Yeah.
They're either biddable or they're not.
That's right. They have traits. They definitely have character traits that may or may not be expressions of certain kinds of intelligence.
Right.
Just one last question.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I have to disappoint you. This field is very studied, and there is a wonderful book, it's called In Defense of Dogs, written by John Neil Brashwell. He's a British researcher, I don't know if you know about it. I read it a few times, and it deals exactly about this issue, how dogs, at least half of it, how dogs and when became domesticated and choose us. So I recommend, if you're interested.
I know, well, we both know it. I tell you, I've checked all the local guys and looked at this literature. Everyone has a different view, and they all have different dates, and some of it's highly, I don't understand the technical genetics, but I pass it by my son-in-law who does, and this is bullshit, and this is based on such and such. And, I know it. It just, you talk to these guys, they just tell you,
There are two dominant theories, that either dogs domesticated themselves, you know, whatever it was 40,000 years ago in Central Asia, or dogs 10,000 years ago were domesticated by people.
Well, now we think the latest Nature, I think, has a piece that it turns out there's dual, like the pig, the dog has dual domestication.
That's right.
That just came out, I think, in Nature, in China and in Central Asia. And they just footnote on the Canaan dog, they've discovered in 2018 some fabulous petroglyphs in Arabia that were 10,000 years before the present, and the dog in them looks like the Canaan dog.
Right.
And the anthropologists the molecular anthropologists who do this show you a picture of the modern Canaan dog. I show you these, and the dogs in the petroglyphs, and
it's the same dog.
same dog, and people scratch their head.
I have to say, I wish Rudolphina was here, because Rudolphina would definitely have an opinion.
Right.
And would be sure that she was right. And she probably was right. Because she was super interested in the whole question of canine domestication and what we can learn from it.
No, it's a great question. But
It's been such a fascinating event.
Thank you so much.